This is the August 12, 2021 Reid-Hillview Airport Airborne Lead Study South County Community Meeting, 6 p.m. by virtual teleconference. This is Peggy Doyle, Deputy Clerk for the County of Santa Clara, with announcements for tonight's Reid-Hillview Airport Airborne Lead Study South County Community Meeting. Simultaneous Spanish and Vietnamese interpretation are available. To access the audio feed for either language, click the Interpretation tab under the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. From there, select Spanish or Vietnamese. Clicking the same interpretation tab will return you to the English audio feed where you can select English or off. If you do not turn on interpretation, you will hear the entire meeting in English with consecutive translation of any Spanish or Vietnamese comments or questions. American Sign Language translation will be visible throughout the meeting. If you would like to enable captioning, click the Live Transcript tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. From there, you can select subtitles that will appear on the bottom of your screen. You can also select View Full Transcript for a live transcript that will appear on the right side of your screen. These announcements will now be translated into Spanish and Vietnamese. Rosario, if you could provide a Spanish translation.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Peggy Doyle y soy representante adjunta del Condado de Santa Clara con anuncios para esta reunión de San José con el estudio de plomo en el aire del aeropuerto de Reid-Hillview. Tenemos servicio de interpretación simultánea en español y en vietnamita disponible, y para acceder al audio con idiomas, hagan clic en el icono de interpretación en el globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. Seleccione español o vietnamita. Haciendo clic en la misma pestaña de interpretación, regresarán al audio en inglés, en donde pueden seleccionar inglés o apagado. Si no activa la pestaña de interpretación, escuchará toda la reunión en inglés con interpretación consecutiva en las preguntas en español y en vietnamita. También tenemos disponible interpretación en señas en inglés durante la reunión, y también se puede activar el servicio de subtítulos y de vista completa, que también se encuentra en la parte inferior de la pantalla, haciendo clic en CC, o también transcripción de vista completa.
Phung An, if you could now translate into Vietnamese.
Xin chào buổi tối, đây là Peggy Doyle, Phó Thư ký quận Santa Clara, với thông báo về buổi họp cộng đồng trưởng nhóm nghiên cứu hàng không sân bay Reid-Hillview tối nay ở San José. Cuộc họp này đang được ghi lại. Cuộc họp dự kiến sẽ kết thúc vào lúc 9 giờ tối và sẽ có một khoảng giải lao ngắn sau mỗi tiếng đồng hồ. Có thông dịch đồng thời tiếng Tây Ban Nha và tiếng Việt. Để truy cập nguồn dữ liệu âm thanh do một trong hai ngôn ngữ như trên, hãy nhấn vào thanh phiên dịch bên dưới có biểu tượng quả địa cầu ở cuối màn hình thu phóng của quý vị. Từ đó có thể chọn tiếng Tây Ban Nha hoặc tiếng Việt, Spanish hoặc Vietnamese. Nhấn vào cùng một thanh thông dịch Interpretation sẽ đưa bạn trở lại nguồn dữ liệu âm thanh tiếng Anh, nơi quý vị có thể chọn tiếng Anh hoặc là tắt, ở đây sẽ là tắt phần tiếng Anh để mà nghe tiếng Việt được rõ hơn. Phần bình luận công khai từ những người nói tiếng Tây Ban Nha và Việt Nam sẽ được dịch trên nguồn cấp dữ liệu âm thanh tiếng Anh. Nếu quý vị không bật thông dịch, quý vị sẽ nghe thấy toàn bộ cuộc họp này bằng tiếng Anh với bản dịch liên tiếp và cách nhận xét bằng tiếng Tây Ban Nha và tiếng Việt. Bản dịch ngôn ngữ ký hiệu cử chỉ sẽ hiển thị trong suốt cuộc họp. Xin cảm ơn. Thank you.
And that concludes our announcements.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am Sylvia Gallegos. I am a Deputy County Executive with the County of Santa Clara. I would like to welcome you to our community meeting to review the county's study of lead emissions from general aviation airplanes at Reid-Hillview Airport. Before I explain the purpose of the meeting, I'd like to provide background on the study. In 2018, our Board of Supervisors asked staff to prepare a study to learn whether airplanes using lead-based fuel contributed to lead exposure in children who live nearby. After nearly a year of work, our researcher is prepared to present his findings. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to have our researcher, who I will introduce later, explain his findings. and allow everyone to ask questions about the study. Tonight's meeting is not to discuss the future of the airport. I would ask you to make your comments and reserve them for the Board of Supervisors meeting next Tuesday, August 17th at 6 p.m., where you can learn what staff proposes to do about the study findings, and you may share your comments directly with our elected officials. After the study is presented, we will open up the meeting for people to submit in writing questions. And at the end of the meeting, if time is remaining, and we currently plan to go to 9 p.m., we would invite people to ask questions orally if they are not able to submit their questions in writing. Now I'd like to ask Peggy Doyle to explain how you may submit your questions in writing.
If you would like to submit a question, click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. A window will open with a space at the bottom to type and send your question. If you would like to see questions that are electronically answered, select the All Questions tab. For example, Colin asked, where can I find the complete airborne lead study in tonight's presentation? And I replied with a link and that information. Colin also asked, how can I attend the August 17 Board of Supervisors meeting when they discuss the study, where they will discuss the study? And a Zoom link and agenda for the meeting were provided.
And now I would like to introduce Supervisor Mike Wasserman, who represents South County on the Board of Supervisors.
Thank you, Sylvia, and welcome everyone. Yes, South County is part of my district, part of District 1. It's always an honor and a privilege to be here in a community meeting with South County people. I look forward to hearing some more of the details from the reports, the surveys that were done, and most of all, hearing from the public and questions and comments that they have regarding tonight's report of the study. Thank you, Sylvia.
And now I would like to introduce two people, Dr. Sammy Zaran, who is the study author of the study that is the subject of tonight's meeting. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Lanfear, who is an expert on the effects of environmental toxin and exposures to that. And so we'll start with Dr. Zaran. And if you'd like to share your screen, please.
Again, just a moment. Can you see?
Yes, we can.
Sorry. Just a moment here. So I'm going to jump right in. First, I want to thank the county for arranging this important evening, allowing us to share what we have learned over the last year in studying the data available to us. I wish to thank Dr. Christopher Keys for being with us this evening. Christopher is lead data scientist at Mountain Data Group and was critically involved in analyses and authorship of the report. I'd also like to thank all persons in attendance from the community. We look forward to your many questions and comments going forward. As you might imagine, we've received many questions and comments from the community upon release of the report. In addition to our prepared remarks this evening, we have conducted additional analyses to address many thoughtful questions from the community that, if the time permits, we hope to share with you in the Q&A portion of the evening. What follows is a condensed summary of the report. Despite our best efforts, the report has been described to me as a difficult document, like most technical analyses. With that in mind, in this presentation, where possible, we have limited the use of technical language and removed from the presentation all statistical equations and tables peppered with coefficients. Some of the technical language, unfortunately, is inescapable, and my apologies in advance for that. All that said, the presentation will mostly involve pictures that summarize the many challenging and complicated programming, statistical, and econometric judgments made. I will also speak a bit slower than I normally would to enable translation services provided at this event. This is a brief outline of what I intend to cover in the presentation. I'll begin with some abbreviated remarks about what has been learned by epidemiologists and various health scientists with respect to the risks or health consequences of lead exposure. Then I'll walk you through some of the data amassed and the measurement decisions made. I'll share some of the main results pertaining to our three main indicators of risk, namely proximity to the airport, residing downwind of the airport, and the co-movement of the blood lead levels of children with measured quantities of traffic and aviation gasoline sold at the airport. Then I'll present some, but not all, of the extended analyses performed. And then we'll end with some conclusions, which will recapitulate what we've learned. While knowledge of the toxic effects of lead been known for many hundreds of years, the evidence amassed by modern science indicates that children exposed to lead suffer substantial, long-lasting, and possibly irreversible negative health, behavioral, and cognitive outcomes. Numerous studies have linked elevated blood lead levels in children to cognitive and intellectual impairments, poor academic achievement, and higher risk of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders, among other deleterious outcomes. Importantly, the relationship between child cognitive ability and blood lead is nonlinear. By that we mean the measured losses in cognitive ability are steeper at lower as opposed to higher blood lead levels. Consider the following graphics. Graphic A is from a published study by Dr. Lanphier et al., 2005, an international pooled sample, illustrating the notion that the loss in intellectual ability is steeper at lower blood lead levels. On the horizontal axis, we have child blood lead level measured in micrograms per deciliter of blood. And on the vertical axis, we have child IQ, an imperfect but widely used indicator of certain kinds of cognitive ability. Note how the addition of 1 microgram of lead in a child's bloodstream produces substantially greater loss in measured ability at lower as opposed to higher blood lead levels. I want you to imagine for a moment that we add 1 microgram per deciliter to a child that presents with 25 micrograms per deciliter. That incremental movement produces a decline, but a decline that's rather small at this level. As we move toward the origin of the graphic, if we were to add a microgram per deciliter at a very low level, it produces a substantially bigger decline in cognitive ability. This loss in ability from exposure to lead in early childhood echoes through a child's academic life. Consider graphic B from a published study by Miranda et al., linking child blood lead levels at age 2 to performance on standardized tests in 4th grade. Again, we see the signature nonlinear effects of lead exposure. The loss in academic performance is steeper at lower blood lead levels in both reading comprehension and mathematics. Studies by scientists like Dr. Lamphere and Dr. Miranda have caused various health organizations to conclude that there is no safe level of lead in a child's body. I quote, "Even low levels of lead in blood have been shown to affect IQ, ability to pay attention, and academic achievement." The FAA fact sheet is more detailed in its statement. Quote, "All forms of lead are toxic if inhaled or ingested. Lead can affect human health in several ways, including effects on the nervous system, red blood cells, and cardiovascular and immune systems. Infants and young children are especially sensitive to even low levels of lead, which may contribute to behavioral and learning problems and lower IQ. Children have increased sensitivity due to their developing nervous systems." Now, it might be tempting to assume that lead exposure in the United States is a rear view or legacy problem. After all, the blood lead levels of children in the United States have declined substantially over the last 4 decades, coincident with a series of regulatory actions by government that expelled lead from paint, plumbing, food cans, and automotive gasoline. Most effective among these various interventions in terms of lowering blood lead levels was the phase out of tetraethyl lead from automotive gasoline. While tetraethyl lead is no longer used as an additive in automotive gasoline, it remains a constituent in aviation gasoline used by an estimated 170,000 piston engine aircraft. These aircraft consume tens of millions of gallons of lead formulated gasoline annually, with lead emissions from this consumption accounting for about half to 2/3 of all lead emissions in the United States today. It is the predominant source of the flow of lead into the environment today. The deposition of lead from these aircraft may be an exposure risk to the estimated 16 million persons residing within 1 kilometer of 20,000 airports that service these aircraft. While many studies have linked aviation gasoline use to elevated atmospheric lead levels in the vicinity of airports, to date, only 2 studies have explicitly linked the use of avgas to the blood lead levels of children residing near general aviation airports. In a study involving 120,000 observations across 6 counties and 66 airports in North Carolina, Miranda et al., in a foundational study, reported a striking correlation between child blood lead levels and airport proximity, with children at 500 and 1,000 meters of an airport, about a half mile, presenting with the highest blood lead levels. In a study involving over 1 million children at 448 airports in Michigan, a study that I conducted with colleagues of mine, we found the child blood lead levels increased substantially with proximity to the airport, increased with observed piston engine aircraft traffic across a subset of airports, increased in the percent of prevailing wind days drifting in the direction of a child's residence, and importantly, declined measurably among children sampled in the months after the tragic events of 9/11, following from measured reductions in traffic. Mountain Data Group and affiliated scientists were asked by the county to assess whether the blood lead levels of sampled children are statistically associated with exposure to lead from aviation-related sources, independent of other sources of lead. Specifically, we set out to test whether the blood lead levels of sampled children near Reid-Hillview and San Martin airports are correlated with child residential proximity, child residential direction or near angle to the airport, and the quantity of piston engine aircraft traffic. What follows is a presentation of results pertaining to Reid-Hillview Airport. Only 68 blood samples were taken from children proximate to San Martin Airport in the last 10 years, prohibiting credible statistical analysis. Next, I'll describe the various data sources deployed in the study, as well as the various measurement decisions that we made to capture exposure risk to lead-formulated aviation gasoline. Blood lead sample data are from the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Branch of the California Department of Public Health. Blood lead samples are collected from children during visits to a healthcare provider. Laboratories send test outcome data to the Lead Poisoning Prevention Branch. We queried the various databases in their possession for records with an indication of residence in Santa Clara County, a date of blood draw occurring within the last 10 years, a date of birth for the sampled person, and a reported blood lead value. Restricting to children 18 years of age and under 18 years of age at the time of draw, residing within 1.5 miles of the airport, and observed in the last 10 years, we arrived at 17,241 blood lead sample observations amenable to statistical analysis. The main outcome of analytic interest is blood lead level measured in micrograms per deciliter. Among children satisfying our inclusion criteria, this is all children, regardless of where they live, regardless if they're up or downwind, regardless if they've been sampled in periods of high or low traffic. The average blood lead level was 1.83 micrograms per deciliter. About 1.7 and 3.2% of sampled children present with blood lead levels in excess of 4.5 and 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, respectively. Given that the bulk of lead emissions are released during departure phases of the landing takeoff cycle, we capture child proximity by calculating the distance from a child's residence at the point of blood draw to the northwest tip of the airport. As with previous research, we analyze this residential distance effect both continuously and by division into 3 orbits of risk: a half mile to 1 mile, and 1 to 1.5 miles from the airport. Now, insofar as exposure to avgas is a genuine source of risk, then we might expect children residing closer to the airport to present with higher blood lead levels, other things held constant. This figure illustrates the measurement logic. Over our 10-year window, we observe about 1,000 children inside that inner orbit as indicated in yellow, about 6,500 records in that next orbit of risk indicated in orange, and finally, just shy of 10,000 children at 1 to 1.5 miles, that third orbit of risk indicated in blue. Airport proximity, of course, by itself is an imperfect measure of avgas exposure risk. The fate and transport of lead emissions depend on the direction of prevailing winds. Every child present in our data at the point of blood draw is assigned a near angle to the airport corresponding to the 4 cardinal directions of north, east, south, and west. In this radial plot, we summarize the behavior of wind at Reid-Hillview over the last 10 years. Each wedge displays the percentage of wind days that emanate from a defined direction. Here, we see that the winds originate overwhelmingly from the west-northwest. In total, we observe about 6,000 children north of the airport, about 1,000 or 1,100 children east of the airport, 3,500 records south of the airport, and about 6,600 records west of the airport. Insofar as avgas exposure is a source of risk, then children east of the airport should present with higher blood lead levels. The volume of traffic varies meaningfully between airports and, importantly, within an airport in time. Therefore, two children residing in the same household but sampled at different moments in the calendar year may present with different blood lead levels coincident with the volume of traffic at the airport. To capture this risk, we collected daily data on piston engine aircraft departures and arrivals from the Federal Aviation Administration and monthly quantities of aviation gasoline sold to consumers at the airport. I'm going to stop here to give you some appreciation of the quantity of lead released. From 2011 to 2018, 2.3 million gallons of lead formulated gasoline was sold at the airport. At about 2 grams of lead per gallon, that's over 10,000 pounds of lead consumed. Based on an EPA estimate that 95% of lead consumed is emitted, over this short 8-year period, about 5 metric tons of lead was emitted at the airport. Importantly, these figures do not include aircraft landing at the airport that fueled elsewhere. In addition to child proximity to lead emitting toxic release inventory facilities throughout the county and child residents in neighborhoods with higher risk of exposure to lead-based paint, as indicated by the age of the housing stock in the neighborhood of child residents, we control for many other factors that are correlated with child blood lead levels. We look at the child's age, gender, the method of draw, the season of the blood draw, the year of the blood draw. We also look at indications of the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood in which the child resides, the percent of adults with a college degree, the neighborhood median housing values, neighborhood median household income, and importantly, neighborhood fixed effects, an indicator for every single neighborhood to absorb all other unobserved factors present in the neighborhood that may account for variation in the outcome. By combining all of these factors in a single statistical equation, we can estimate the independent statistical associations between our main indicators of avgas exposure and child blood lead levels. In the presentation of our basic results, we will begin with residential distance, then move to residential near angle, and then to measures of piston engine aircraft traffic and aviation gasoline sales. We can return to this in the Q&A if you like, but this table basically shows that sampled children are statistically similar with respect to their gender, residential near angle, age, piston engine aircraft traffic exposure, sample order, and year and timing of blood draw. On variables where we do, in fact, observe differences. For instance, fix your eyes right here with respect to the percentage of the housing stock built prior to 1960. These are homes with substantially higher risk of presenting with lead-based paint we could see that children in the outer orbits have older housing stock relative to children in the nearest orbit. Across all of these variables, whatever differences we find, all of them function to inflate the blood lead levels of children in the outer perimeters, causing us to conclude that our observed differences that I'm about to present to you are likely attenuated or conservative. So our first result, holding all other factors constant, we find that the blood lead levels of children in the nearest orbit are about 1/5 of a microgram higher than children in outer orbits. Importantly, these results are stable with respect to the incremental inclusion of control variables and supported by analyses involving the study of distance continuously. To provide context, this calculated difference of a fifth of a microgram is approximately equal to 50% of the estimated increase in child blood lead levels at the height of the Flint water crisis over baseline levels. We know this to be true because we conducted and published an NIH-funded study analyzing over 21,000 blood lead samples in Genesee County before, during, and after the Flint water crisis. I recognize that it is an imperfect comparison with respect to the nature of the exposure. In one case, we have contaminated water. In the RHV case, or the Reid-Hillview case, we have atmospheric deposition of the toxin. However, it is worth noting that the Flint water crisis unfolded over a period of 1.5 years. By contrast, at the airport, the release of lead into the lived environment is daily, unabated, landing on the local population, an undeniably harmful toxin. Next, we share results pertaining to residential near angle. Recall, each child is assigned a cardinal direction to the airport because the winds prevail from the west-northwest. Children east of the airport should present with higher blood levels. Again, controlling for all factors and compatible with a hypothesis of avgas exposure risk. We find that children east of the airport present with blood lead levels that are significantly higher than all other sampled children. Residing east of the airport is associated with a 0.4 microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead levels, equal to a 25% increase over other sampled children. This margin of difference is equal to the observed difference in sampled children before and at the height of the Flint water crisis. Next, we'll share results pertaining to measured levels of piston engine aircraft traffic. This figure summarizes how child blood lead levels change with an increase in measured traffic. Counting for all other factors, the upward sloping line here indicates the child blood lead levels increase as the quantity of piston engine aircraft traffic increases. This relationship also obtains if we substitute this variable on the horizontal axis for the quantity of aviation gasoline sold at the airport. Again, the characteristic upward sloping relationship. And going from the minimum to the maximum of child piston engine aircraft traffic exposure, we find that child blood lead levels increase by about 0.3 micrograms per deciliter. This result again obtains if we substitute traffic for the quantity of avgas sold. And this relationship is likely linear, as supported by analyses in the report showing that the division of traffic into low, medium, and high categories with blood levels rising incrementally in those divisions. In support of these basic results, we perform several ancillary tests to extend and support the body of evidence from our basic analyses. Here, I will share with you 3 of those exercises, but we could return to the others if you like in the Q&A. The first extension involves categorical measurement of blood lead levels to see if exposure risk to aviation gasoline increases the likelihood that a sampled child presents with a blood lead level in excess of 4.5 micrograms per deciliter, a very high reference value set by the CDPH to allocate scarce resources toward the protection of the most vulnerable children. We display 2 sets of results from this exercise. One set, in light blue, pertains to the probability or chance that a child presents with a blood lead level below 1.5 micrograms per deciliter, and the other set in navy here pertains to the probability or chance that a child supersedes that reference value of 4.5 micrograms. These probabilities are calculated by distance, near angle, and traffic. Fixing your eyes for a moment on the navy blue graphics. The top right-hand corner, we find that the chance of a child at 1 to 1.5 miles presenting with a very high blood lead level is 22% lower than statistically similar children most proximate to the airport. Children east of the airport, we find, are 2.4 times more likely to present with blood lead levels in excess of this reference value. Finally, we find that the risk of exceedance increases substantially if a child is exposed to maximum as opposed to minimum traffic. This slide basically recapitulates what I just said. Next, we present results from a test that may be regarded as the most powerful of the tests performed. In this test, we ask whether the blood lead levels of children respond differently to fluctuations in traffic depending on proximity to the airport. Insofar as exposure to aviation gasoline is, in fact, an independent source of risk, then the blood lead levels of children most proximate to the airport should be more sensitive to changes in the quantity of traffic. Allow me to move a bit slower here with this graphic. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of piston engine aircraft traffic going from the observed minimum to the maximum. On the vertical axis, we have predicted child blood lead level, or the adjusted mean of blood lead level. 2 lines intersect the space. One corresponding to children within a half mile of the airport, and the other corresponding to children in the outer orbits. To use the language of medicine here, we could think of children in the nearest orbit as our treatment group, and children in the outer orbit as our control group. Now imagine that we turn a dial in traffic from low to high. Note how the blood lead levels of sampled children in the nearest orbit rise steeply in response to traffic. Also note how the blood lead levels of children in outer orbits also increase, but substantially more modestly. Again, this observed statistical interaction behaves similarly if we substitute piston engine aircraft traffic for the quantity of aviation gasoline sold at the airport. Overall, among sampled children at less than a half mile from the airport, an increase from the minimum to maximum traffic is associated with an estimated 0.83 microgram increase in child blood lead levels. This tells us that children nearest the airport are especially sensitive to fluctuations in traffic and are especially sensitive to the quantities of lead formulated aviation gasoline sold at the airport. Resulting from various efforts by the County of Santa Clara to limit the spread of COVID-19, Piston engine aircraft traffic declined measurably at Reid-Hillview Airport over the months of late February to July of 2020. Traffic declined by about 34 to 44%, depending on the baseline used. Intriguingly, traffic at the airport recovered to pre-pandemic levels in August to December of 2020. These dynamics in aircraft operations at the airport present us with a natural experiment. Insofar as avgas exposure is a genuine source of risk, then we might expect children sampled in this contraction period to present with lower blood lead levels. Children sampled in this contraction window presented with significantly lower blood lead levels, about 1/4 of a microgram per deciliter lower than children not sampled in this contraction window. The size of the effect observed is consistent with what we observe in models that restrict to fluctuations of piston engine aircraft traffic over time. This is basically a restatement of what I just said. Now, allow me to summarize what we've learned. I'm going to stay close to the written text here. Evidence from main analyses for a statistical link between aviation gasoline exposure risk and child blood lead levels include the blood lead levels of sampled children increased significantly with proximity to the airport. The blood lead levels are significantly higher among children residing east and predominantly downwind of the airport, and increase in the quantity of downwind days drifting in the residential direction of the child from the date of blood draw. The blood lead levels of sampled children increase significantly with measured traffic at the airport and with monthly quantities of gasoline sold at the airport from the date of blood draw. Evidence for a statistical link between child blood lead levels and avgas exposure from extended analyses include the probability that blood lead levels exceed the reference value of 4.5 micrograms per deciliter increases with proximity to the airport, residing east of the airport, and with quantities of traffic. The blood lead levels of children proximate to the airport are significantly more dose responsive or sensitive to changes in traffic and the quantity of gasoline sold. The blood lead levels of children sampled in the traffic contraction moment from February to July of 2020 presented with significantly lower blood lead levels, compatible with an avgas exposure risk hypothesis. Not presented here, but fully described in the report, children commuting toward the airport to attend school present with substantially higher blood lead levels than children commuting away from the airport to attend school. We also compute sizable economic benefits that accrue to the local population from a reduction in traffic or from a reduction in the consumption of lead formulated gasoline to the tune of $11 to $25 million for this cohort that exists in perpetuity. On the need to limit lead exposure from aviation gasoline, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine maintains, and I quote, because lead does not appear to exhibit a minimum concentration in blood, which there are no health effects, there is a compelling reason to reduce or eliminate aviation lead emissions. The ensemble, not one test, but many hundreds of tests that appear in the report, support the compelling need to limit aviation lead emissions to safeguard the welfare and life chances of at-risk children and adults. Thank you.
And now let us introduce Dr. Lanfear.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm going to first provide a short description of why I was asked to provide my perspective on this study. And then I'll talk a little bit about lead toxicity, its health effects on humans, and finally share some evidence that Dr. Zoran provided to me from his study, how this presentation likely underestimated the impact of lead exposure on children surrounding Reid-Hillview Airport. So my name is Bruce Lanfear. I'm a physician and a public health scientist. I've been studying the impacts of lead exposure on children and adults for the past 25 years. I've also been studying the various sources of exposure to children and adults during that time. As Sammy said, lead is a poison. We've known it's a poison for centuries, certainly even since the Roman era. Most of my research over the past 20 years or so was really about trying to answer the question, how much lead is too much? And as Sammy said, scientists have now agreed around the world that there is no safe level of lead in blood. I wanted to give you first my impression of the report by Dr. Sammy Zoran, Christopher Keyes, and their team. And I wanted to begin by asking each of you to imagine how you would begin if you were asked to identify whether planes flying in and out of the Reid-Hillview Airport that used leaded gasoline were contributing to children's blood lead levels in communities surrounding that airport. This is really quite a challenging task. You'd need to know how close the children live to the airport, the household income, the amount of lead in their children's blood, the amount of fuel used at the airport, the amount of leaded fuel used at the airport. You'd also need to be sure that you're protecting the privacy of the children. On top of that, you need to test various ways to prove or disprove that aircraft emissions were a source of children's exposure, and that exposure couldn't be explained by other sources of exposure like lead paint. So what they did was really remarkable. They merged a series of data sets. None of these were designed to answer this question. They included birth certificates, blood lead tests from the California Department of Public Health, age of housing data, information from the airport and the Federal Aviation Administration, And as you saw from the presentation, they did a masterful job to test this hypothesis. What they did, in a sense, was to estimate over and above other sources of lead that children around the country are exposed to. How much more did living near this airport add on to that baseline? By looking at blood lead level changes relative to the proximity of the airport, whether they were downwind from the airport, how much fuel, leaded fuel was being used, the volume of traffic, and even the intersection of some of those, like air traffic and proximity. They showed convincingly that the leaded gasoline used at Reid-Hillview Airport endangered the lives of children who live around this airport. Still, they underestimated the impact of exposure on children. Now, before I jump into some of the explanation for that, I wanted to review some of the evidence about the toxicity of lead exposure. We're focusing here mostly on children and on brain-based conditions associated with lead. For cognition, we oftentimes measure IQ or reading or academic abilities. For behaviors, we've seen increases in ADHD type behaviors and conduct disorder, a type of acting out behavior in young children. And these are consistent. These aren't one or two studies. These are dozens of studies published over decades. And we also have correlates in laboratory settings where animals were studied. And finally, we have brain imaging studies that show as childhood lead increases, we see reductions in the size of the prefrontal cortex in particular, the part of the brain that makes us most distinctly human. I won't be focusing much on the brain imaging, but I will talk about the behaviors and cognition at a little bit more length. So first, to start with a landmark study by Dr. Herbert Needleman, published in 1979, Dr. Needleman studied over 2,000 school-aged children in Massachusetts. He had the homeroom teachers rate each of these children on a whole variety of behaviors that you can see here, whether they were hyperactive or impulsive, whether they were dependable, whether they were organized, if they were easily frustrated or distractible. And what they saw when they asked the children to donate their baby teeth, because you can measure the amount of lead in children's baby teeth, the shed teeth that they lose, and you can estimate lifetime exposure to lead. What they found from these teeth and these homeroom teacher questionnaires is that as tooth lead level increased, they saw children had more problems with hyperactivity and impulsivity. They were more likely to be rated as daydreamers and less dependable. In short, what Herb Needleman found was that lead exposure is a risk factor for ADHD. About 10 years ago, we published a national study looking at lead and ADHD. And we found that children, 8 to 15-year-old children in the United States, who had a blood lead level over 1.7 microgram per deciliter, that's equivalent to 17 parts per billion of lead in blood, they were about 2 to 2.5 times more likely to have ADHD. And we were able to estimate, because it was a national study, that about 1 in 5 children who had ADHD in the United States had ADHD because of lead exposure. Now, Sammy showed a graph that's similar to this one. This was the first study I did where we saw this steep decrement in reading ability of children. And to be honest, it went over my head because I was trained and we continue to regulate most toxic chemicals like lead as if there's a safe level or threshold. But what this study showed is that there isn't a safe level or a threshold. Indeed, it suggests that reading scores begin to drop precipitously beginning at the very lowest levels of exposure. Well, we did 2 additional studies. This most recent one published in 2005 that Dr. Zoran showed you earlier showed the same pattern. And so by this time, this was our 3rd study showing the same steep decrement in children's reading or cognitive abilities. I couldn't ignore it anymore. What this essentially shows is that not only is there no safe level, but we see steeper decrements in IQ at the lowest levels. Let me put that into numerical terms. If you look across the range of exposure that we studied in children, going from 0, well, less than 1 microgram per deciliter on your left over to 30 microgram per deciliter on the right side, what we found is that the first 10 microgram per deciliter increase in children's blood lead levels were associated with a 6 to 7 IQ point decrement. That's really large and much larger than most of us would have predicted 20 years ago when that first study was done. The second 10 microgram per deciliter increase from 10 to 20 microgram per deciliter was associated with a 2 to 2.5 IQ point decrement, and the third about a 1 IQ point decrement, going from 20 to 30 microgram per deciliter. So it's worse having a blood lead level of 30. We estimate that children who have a blood lead level of 30, all other things equal, would have a 9 IQ point decrement relative to children who have a blood lead level less than 1. But what Dr. Zoran said earlier is that we see a greater drop for a given exposure at the very lowest levels of exposure. So it's better to have a blood lead level of 5 or less than it is to have a blood lead level of 30. But an increase in blood lead from 1 to 5 results in a greater drop in IQ than an increase from 25 to 30. Remarkably, in 2012, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, the World Health Organization, subsequently the EPA, Health Canada, Germany, and many other countries concluded there is no safe level of lead. There have been over a dozen studies that looked at blood lead levels and IQ or academic abilities, and all of them have seen that same pattern. None of them have refuted it. Now, we don't expect that kind of consistent results from scientific research, but when you see that kind of consistency, you can't ignore it. I want to use a couple slides to show you the impact of toxic chemicals on children's intellectual ability. And I'm going to use it in a national study showing what happens to a 6-year birth cohort in the United States for a 5 IQ point decrement, which would be associated with about a 5 microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead levels.
Typical distribution of IQ scores. Most of us have IQ scores that fall between 85 and 115 points. Only 2.5% of children have an IQ above 130, which is considered gifted. There are about 6 million children in this group. On the other end of the distribution, another 2.5% of children have an IQ below 70, which is considered challenged. The impact of exposure to a toxin like lead causes a 5-point drop in IQ. This shift results in a 57% increase in the number of children that are challenged, from 6 million to 9.4 million. There is a corresponding decrease in the number of children that are gifted, from 6 million to 2.4 million. Little shifts matter. The impact of exposure to another toxin, like flame retardants, results in a further increase in the number of children who are challenged, from 9.4 million to over 11 million. There is a further decrease in the number of gifted children.
So we're focused here on lead exposure and IQ deficits in children or cognitive deficits in children. But we also know that children in California and around Reid-Hillview Airport are exposed to other toxic chemicals. California children, for example, have some of the highest levels of PBDEs in the world. That's a type of chemical flame retardant that we know reduces intellectual abilities. Air pollution and pesticides also increase children's likelihood of learning disabilities. And so we have to think about the cumulative impact as well.
Typical distribution.
So I want to use this next slide to show why even small increments in IQ scores have a big impact on the health of a community. Here you can see, if you follow my cursor, in this red box here, there's 500,000 children in the United States. Now it's a little bit lower, but let's keep this for hypothetical purposes. 500,000 children who have a blood lead level of 5 microgram per deciliter or higher. On average, after taking other factors into account, like poverty and maternal intelligence, those children lose about 6 IQ points from that lead exposure, from 5 microgram per deciliter lead exposure. If you multiply 500,000 times 6 IQ points, you see that there's a total of 3 million IQ points lost in that group of kids. Now let's look at the next strata or group. Children who had a blood level between 2.1 and 5 microgram per deciliter, almost 6 million children. They only lose 1.5 IQ points per child on average. That seems small compared to this group up here, but because there's so many more children, you now multiply your almost 6 million times 1.6, and you can see here that's 9.3 million IQ points lost. So if we only focused on the very high risk kids, in this case, greater than 5 microgram per deciliter, we would only protect or preserve 3 million out of the 23 million IQ points lost. As Dr. Zoran said, the impact of lead exposure is lifelong. We've now got several birth cohort studies where they followed children into adulthood and shown that higher lead exposure in childhood is associated with diminished IQ, certainly into adolescence, but also into the 20s and 30s. In a recent study from New Zealand, they found that higher lead exposure in children was associated not only with ongoing diminished IQ deficits in children, but the children who had higher blood lead levels never met the same socioeconomic status as their parents compared to the children who had lower blood lead levels. So this is one way to think about what happens to kids.
Lead toxicity doesn't only impair children, it affects people over their entire life. The ability to think and reason increases as we mature, peaks during young adulthood, and then begins to decline in our 60s. Children who have higher lead exposure never reach the same peak ability as children with lower exposure. At the other end of life, adults with higher lead exposure have accelerated decline in their mental abilities and may develop dementia sooner.
So lead has lifelong implications. And for another cohort of children to be exposed, we'll see impacts that last a lifetime. So now I want to step back and provide more specific perspective on this report that Dr. Zoran and Christopher Keys and their team compiled. This is one of their most important slides, showing that for children under 18 years of age, there's much higher blood lead levels of the children who live closer to the airport, measured as less than half a mile. But by focusing on younger and older children, they've underestimated the impact on children's exposure. As you can see here, if we just focus on toddlers and compare it to the blue bar, which is all children measured in the report, you can see that the blood lead concentrations of the toddlers are considerably higher. Now, why is that? Well, if you can think about children of different ages as being different types of vacuum cleaners, the toddlers are much better at picking up lead from their environment, in part because they still are crawling around on the floors and they have a ongoing mouthing where they put non-food items, their hands, dust into their mouths. This isn't only for lead. Children are also better at picking up pesticides and other toxins in their environment, particularly from house dust. So by focusing on older children, it actually underestimates the impact for younger children, for toddlers who are better indicators or better monitors, if you will, because that's in a sense what we're using these kids as monitors for lead exposure from the airport. I want to also just provide some perspective. Again, why don't older children have higher blood lead levels? Well, if we take an older child, let's say a 12-year-old child who lived close to the airport their entire lives, and compared it to, or let's say we'll take 100 kids who are about 12 years old that live close to the airport and compare it to 100 toddlers who lived close to the airport for 12 to 24 months. The 12-year-old will have much larger burden of lead, much larger body burden of lead, but most of that lead will be stored away in their bones. Most of the lead that we pick up over our lifetime is stored in our bones. You can see that, for example, when women go through menopause, they start to break down their bones more quickly than they build them back up. And the level of lead circulating in their blood increases by 30% because of those lifetime stores that they picked up. So the older children have more lead in their bodies, but toddlers have more recent exposure because of the mouthing behaviors and because of pound for pound, they ingest more, they breathe more, and they drink more. And so if their environment is contaminated, they're going to have a higher blood lead level. You can also see it in this slide that Sammy described as sort of the key slide that shows what happens with aircraft traffic and residential distance. As aircraft traffic increased, you can see blood lead levels increased dramatically for children who live close to the airport. That's in the red line. For children who live further away from the airport, they really didn't change much. Now that's for all children. And as I've said, by using older children, we've underestimated the impact. If you look, for example, at the maximum exposure in the children under 18 years of age, it's about 2.5 microgram per deciliter. And now if you look at it for toddlers, you can see once again, blood lead levels increase as air traffic increases, but only for those who live in close proximity. But in this case now, you can see that it increased to about 3.2 microgram per deciliter, somewhat higher than all children. So by looking at all children, the report underestimated the impact of aviation fuel, leaded aviation fuel on children's blood lead levels. This is again looking at toddlers. And while they, in this report, they estimated the independent contribution from each of these risk factors, by not looking at the cumulative impact, it gave a sense that perhaps the exposures were less than they were. So looking again here at toddlers, we can see that the average blood lead level of children who lived, toddlers who lived within half a mile was about 2.5. But then if we look at the mean blood lead of children who live closer to the airport with maximum traffic, it increased to 3.3. Then if we looked at children who lived downwind in the eastern part of the airport, it increased to 3.5. And finally, if we added lower SES household, we can see it increased further to 3.7. But this too doesn't really give you, I think, a good sense of what happened. Now what I want to do is look at the percent, and this is using the California Department of Public Health's action level, 4.5 micrograms per deciliter. And as you can see here, corresponding to these blood lead levels that I just showed you, you can see that the percent of children who have a blood lead in excess of this action level increases from 2.6 to 3.4 to 6.3, and finally 8.9. But wait, there's still more. I was recently on a working group of the Centers for Disease Control led advisory committee, and we were asked whether the CDC should lower their action level from 5 microgram per deciliter, which is a little higher than what California used, to 3.5 microgram per deciliter. And our working group voted unanimously to lower the action level to 3.5 microgram per deciliter. The Centers for Disease Control led advisory committee concurred, and we can expect that this level will be lower. Now, having said that, 3.5 microgram per deciliter is arbitrary. We've already said there's no safe level. Why not put it down closer to 0? Well, it's really a function of the resources that are needed. It's not because we don't want it to be lower, and it shouldn't be lower. But now let's look at what happens to those percents when we look at the percent of toddlers with blood lead levels in excess of 3.5 microgram per deciliter. Now you can see close proximity, over 5% exceed 3.5 microgram per deciliter, 7% when you add maximum traffic, 10.5% when you add eastern downwind residents, and finally almost 14% when you add lower socioeconomic status. These are substantial impacts over and above whatever other sources other children experience. And just as a way to summarize this, you can see first all children, that is children younger than 18, in the blue bars, and what happens to their percent in excess of 4.5 microgram per deciliter. For toddlers, again, 4.5 microgram per deciliter with each increment in risk. And finally, toddlers greater than 3.5. Again, 1 out of 6 children have a blood lead level with all of those risk factors. Another way that the report underestimated the impact on children's learning ability and behavior problems was by relying on blood lead levels. Now, I'm not saying blood lead levels aren't a good measure. We call it a biomarker or biologic marker of exposure. I've used blood lead levels for the vast majority of my studies, and they are the optimal way to measure lead in large epidemiologic studies. But we also know, as you can see from this study done in Yugoslavia by Gail Wasserman and her team, that in this case, when you look at bone lead and blood lead separately, you see that they both exhibit this steep decrement in intellectual ability, beginning from the first 25% of children to the second 25% of kids. That steep drop off, which is exactly what you've seen in all these other graphs. And we see that in their study with blood lead too. But when we put bone lead and blood lead into the same model, that is, we look at them together, what happens is the bone lead remains and blood lead is no longer predicting children's intellectual abilities. That's because bone lead is such a better indicator of lifetime exposure than lead in blood is. And so because of that, this study is underestimating the impact, the health impacts on children. There's a few other things worth mentioning. Lead in paint pigment is about 500 nanometers in diameter. In contrast, lead particles in aircraft are about 4 nanomoles, and they're embedded in about 20 nanomole particles. Why is that important? Well, small particles are much more readily absorbed into the GI tract, into the lungs, and may indeed even go straight up the olfactory nerve into the brain. And so smaller particles are more toxic. Now, we don't have data that compares the toxicity in children of these two different particle sizes, but this is something that we can't ignore. And this was something that the National Academy on Science, Engineering, and Medicine pointed out. And then finally, while Dr. Zoran and his team focused on children, understandably, they really didn't have good access to measures of lead exposure for adults. We know that lead exposure is a risk factor for a variety of diseases in adults, including coronary heart disease. Now, most of you are familiar with the typical risk factors like male or female sex, obesity, smoking, diabetes, salt intake, physical activity, genetic susceptibility. But airborne particles and toxic metals, especially lead, are also risk factors. And I just wanted to show you a quick animation of a study that we did, because we now know that there's no safe level of lead in adults.
Lead is also a risk factor for coronary heart disease. That's when your heart is slowly or suddenly suffocated by an obstruction of the arteries feeding the heart. In a national study, we found that deaths increased sharply at blood levels below 50 parts per billion, the level considered safe. There was no threshold or safe level. If we let the narrowing of this coronary artery represent the risk of dying from heart disease, you can see that most of the narrowing occurs below 50 parts per billion. We found that lead accounts for about 185,000 deaths every year.
That makes lead the leading cause of coronary heart disease deaths in the United States, which is really quite remarkable. And so, while it's understandable that this report focused primarily on children, we shouldn't discount that lead is also toxic to adults. I wanted to end up with this slide. I've heard the term crisis used. It was picked up in newsfeed. One of the experts talked about this not being a crisis. And whenever there's inconsistency in how a word is used, I always go back to the basics. And in this case, I went back to the dictionary to look up the definition of crisis. A time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. Well, this report clearly illustrates that children who live around this airport are experiencing danger, exposure to a toxic metal. It was also defined as a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. And clearly, this is a time when a difficult and important decision must be made. Thank you very much.
So now what we're going to do is take a 10-minute break. I realized from last night's meeting that we should have given our researchers a break. They went quite a long time. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you then. And then we'll move to, as we did last night, to questions that have been submitted. We will read those questions and then have the researchers respond. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. And that would be 7:30. Good evening, everyone. We're back. Before we start the Q&A, I'm going to ask Peggy Doyle to once again explain the procedure for submitting questions in writing.
If you would like to submit a question, click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. A window will open with a space at the bottom to type and send your question. If you would like to see questions that are electronically answered, select the All Questions tab. That's it.
Now I'm going to introduce Mr. David Bruno, who will orally present the questions that have been submitted, and then we would invite the researchers to respond to these questions. Thank you, David.
Thank you. The first question is related to the flight paths. The path that aircraft typically fly around the airport to land in an orderly fashion is normally to the east of the airport center by almost a mile away along White Road on the east side of Cunningham Lake Park. The aircraft flies about 1 mile away and parallel to the most used runway, 31 right, 13 left. Thus, most of the lead generated from that aircraft would be generated at least 1 mile away from the airport and then actually be blown farther away to the southeast due to the prevailing winds from the northwest as the aircraft traveled parallel 1 mile away from the runway. This would not be consistent with your findings as they show most of the lead is within half a mile of the airport. This would suggest there's something else in the area increasing the blood lead levels. Why did you not account for this huge factor of typical flight path in your finding?
Thank you for the question. We did not have access to flight path data. Otherwise, we would have studied it closely. I will note that the results obtained with respect to distance are consistent in direction and magnitude with what was observed in the Miranda et al. Study in 2011, corresponding to child proximity to 66 airports across 6 counties in North Carolina. The coefficients obtained are also consistent with what we observed in our study of 448 airports in Michigan. So that raised our confidence that the distance gradient was correctly estimated.
Thank you. Next question. The gas sold does not all get consumed at the airport. The numbers given are completely misleading. If I buy gas for my car at a gas station, I generally use that gas very far from the gas station. Claiming thousands of pounds of lead is being expended in the area of the airport is completely false. Why was aircraft location and flight time in the area of the airport not factored into your finding?
Again, data that we did not have access to. If we had access to the information, we would have included it in our analysis. What the data provided to us by the county included fuel flowage fee information from which one could derive the quantity of aviation gasoline sold at the airport. I think the bias goes in 2 directions, the one that you described, but also there are planes landing at the airport that fueled elsewhere. And so it's not clear to me what direction the bias obtains.
Thank you. Regarding the period used during the pandemic, how could you have been given a significant number of blood measurements during the pandemic while parents and children would have been on lockdown?
That's a good question. I think it was something on the order of 500 observations in that period, but I have to refer back to the data to get the precise number. I think the estimation in that exercise is actually probably conservative, in part because the composition of children sampled in that moment have risk factors that increase their blood lead levels. In the report, we provide a table to that effect. And so because the composition of children shifted toward kids that are more, not less likely to present with higher blood lead levels, the difference that we observe corresponding with the contraction of traffic at the airport is likely conservative.
Can you explain how the study relates with the findings of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which suggests near negligible lead levels at the airport itself?
First, I would disagree with the characterization of negligible, but allowing me to share my screen so that I can share with you what we've learned from analyses involving data collected at the monitor. These data were provided to us by the county on the 14th of February in 2021, as we were nearing conclusion of the first draft of the manuscript. We examined these data carefully, given the time abbreviated nature of the data, because the data went from 2012 to mid 2018. When we joined that data with the blood lead samples in our possession, there was a substantial reduction in the number of observations from 17,241 children to 11,008 observations. That loss of 1/3 of observations warranted caution in the use of these data. And to our puzzlement, the data coming from the monitor moved idiosyncratically vis-a-vis measured air traffic and the quantity of aviation gasoline sales data that fluctuated together over a calendar year. And so those two reasons warranted caution in the use of this information. But nonetheless, what we've done is we've recapitulated this equation that appears in the report, this time estimating this coefficient beta sub 7 corresponding to the atmospheric concentration of lead measured at the monitor. Here we go through an exercise where we present coefficients, but I'm going to do this in terms of a picture for you. So moving from 0.05 micrograms per cubic meter to 0.12 micrograms per cubic meter, this constitutes the range of lead observed, concentrations of lead observed at the monitor. As one goes up in the concentration, we see a corresponding increase in the blood lead levels of children, all other factors held equal. This difference in the change, right, from 1.79 to 2.1 micrograms per deciliter, a difference of 0.31 micrograms per deciliter, is roughly equivalent to what we observe when we use the quantity of traffic as an input variable or the quantity of aviation gasoline sold. So the results involving the study of this monitor are compatible with what we observe with other indicators of the volume of traffic. Again, though, I wish to reiterate our original caution because of the loss of 1/3 of observations in the linkage of the air quality monitoring data to the blood lead levels in children.
Our next question relates to IQ decrements. Can you explain the control methods that have been used to explain the decrease in IQ resulting from lead exposure, and explain how that fits within a wider context of a decline in IQ in Americans over several decades with no single cause isolated?
I'll allow Bruce to speak to the control methods used in the international pooled sample and various other studies that he's conducted, but I dispute the fact of declining IQ over the last 4 decades. In fact, I think it's moving in the opposite direction, with the exception of some observation in more recent years. It's a well-known phenomenon in the psychometric literature called the Flynn effect, and it is rising IQ intergenerationally. In fact, it requires psychometricians to rescale the test to account for this increase in measured intelligence across the population in time.
So in terms of the controls that we've used, the typical approach for human studies is that we recruit children either in utero, that is, we recruit pregnant women or very young children, and we will measure the lead in their blood or in their teeth. And then we also will collect information on everything from household income, maternal IQ, whether the mother had depressive symptoms during or after pregnancy, smoking, iron status, birth weight, and so forth. In some cases, I should add, we're probably underestimating it. But in any case, we look at those characteristics and then we estimate the IQ decrement associated specifically with lead after holding those other factors constant. We also can rely on laboratory studies, whether that's of live rodents, monkeys, or tissue cultures, to show how lead is toxic and results in parallel behavioral changes or parallel cognitive changes like memory in animal studies or in the neurotransmitters in the brain. So it's all of this evidence collectively that has led scientists to agree, and I would say unanimously agree, and around the world. The only people that I've talked with who dispute that work for the lead industry or just haven't kept up with the literature.
I may also add to that. Can you all still can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. This is some work that I've completed recently with Dr. Christopher Keys, exploiting as a natural experiment the differential phase out of leaded gasoline in cars. You fix your eyes on this graphic. What we have along the horizontal axis is time moving annually. We have all 50 states present in the graphic. The color of the cell corresponds to the concentration of lead per gallon of gasoline. And you can see that the phase out of leaded gasoline behaved differently across states. Some rapidly phasing out, where others not moving as quickly. This time and space variation in the phase out of leaded gasoline, we exploit as a natural experiment. I want you to imagine that you can observe a child born in this period, shortly after a child born in this period, separated by short number of years. Now let's trace their intellectual trajectory in time, observing them much later in life, as they're graduating from high school, taking standardized tests, and we observe that this semi-random or quasi-random phenomenon with respect to the differential phase out of gas is causally linked to performance on standardized tests in early adulthood. We think it's causal because you've got the satisfaction of the time order condition. The cause comes before the effect in time. You satisfy the association condition that they're moving together. And you have the elimination of alternative explanations or non-spuriousness, the spuriousness condition, by the quasi-random design exploited here.
Our next question is, according to the measured values, there is a difference in average blood lead level of 0.12 microgram per deciliter based on distance, which accounts for less than 7% of the 1.81 microgram per deciliter BLL of samples in the farthest distance. Is it accurate to say that over 93% of the blood lead level is due to some other cause?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the arithmetic there. But what I can say is that this was not a study involving the full partitioning of the blood lead levels of children across all sources and causes, but rather an attempt to isolate the independent effects emanating from the airport. And what we can say, I think with some confidence, across an ensemble of tests, proximity to the airport, living downwind from the airport, covariation of the blood lead levels of children with measured quantities of traffic and the quantities of aviation gasoline sold at the airport, the statistical interaction between distance and traffic, the statistical interaction between distance and aviation gasoline, the fact that children that commute away from the airport to attend school present with lower blood lead levels than children that commute toward the airport, the observable reduction in the blood lead levels corresponding with non-pharmaceutical interventions undertaken by the county to reduce the spread of COVID-19 that produced a contraction in the airport, those children presented with lower blood lead levels. Now, it's hard to imagine that there is another factor that is coincident with all of that evidence. And it is through the compile of that evidence that we are forced to conclude that there is a risk emanating from the airport.
Thank you. Our next question relates to the effects of lead on adults. And the questioner is asked, why did the study only focus on children? And how about the effect of lead on adults in the surrounding neighborhood, people employed at the airport and users of the airport?
Thank you for the question. The vast majority of people appearing in the 7 to 9 million records in possession of the California Department of Public Health pertain to children. I think it's an important question. I think that what we've learned in the last couple of decades with respect to the long reach of early childhood exposure necessitates the study of adult population. I've done work on motor neuron disease mortality, exploiting the differential phase out of leaded petrol in Australia, showing that lifetime exposure to lead by way of this channel, petrol, substantially increases the risk of motor neuron disease mortality in Australia. But Bruce could speak to the evidence better than I can.
Well, I would just say I agree. It's a wonderful question. And why haven't we done more? Well, most of the research and most of the health dollars in the United States go towards treatment. Not enough goes towards understanding the upstream causes or root causes of disease. And so because of that, perhaps for some other things as well, we've tended not to fund research that looks at things like lead, like air pollution, as upstream risk factors for lung cancer, coronary heart disease, Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, dementia. And it's clearly time to begin to invest more to understand that. And even in the short term, a study that tries to do the same kind of thing, but not look at blood lead concentrations, but rather the risk of heart attacks or dying from heart attacks in adults who live around the airports where leaded gasoline is used would be a very important study, as well as looking at other risk factors that we know result from excessive lead exposure. Pregnant women who are exposed to higher levels of lead are more likely to give birth too soon, premature infants. They're more likely to give birth to small birth weight infants. They're more likely to experience preeclampsia, severe hypertension, and toxemia of pregnancy. Adults who are exposed to more lead are also more likely to develop renal failure. So lead is one of the leading causes, leading risk factors, if you prefer, of some of the chronic diseases that kill us today. And we haven't done enough to quantify the impacts, even though we know enough to have determined that they are causally related to these health problems.
Toward this question of causation, I'd also like to note a study that I did with Dr. Howard Milkey in New Orleans, looking at the relationship between lead accumulated in surface soils in a neighborhood before and after the flooding of the city, the inundation of 80% of the city's water. And what you can see here is what the soil lead concentrations looked like before the flooding and what they look like after the flooding. And you can see a compression in the variation. That is, the communities, the neighborhoods look more alike after the flooding than they did before. And that the mean level of lead accumulated in soil declined substantially after the flooding. We leverage this as a natural experiment and observe what happens to eclampsia risk in mothers delivering their children in New Orleans. And we observe this corresponding contraction in the risk correlated with the quasi-random contraction in soil lead accumulation.
Thank you. Next question is, do most public health officials consider a blood lead level of 1.96 micrograms per deciliter high?
I think the epidemiological community has reached the conclusion that there is no safe level of lead. Now, what constitutes high is a statistical question. The reference value used by the CDPH and the CDC corresponds to children that appear in the 97.5 percentile of the distribution. Again, this corresponds to children under the age of 6.
I'd just like to add, and I know Sammy brought this up yesterday. I don't remember if he brought it up tonight or not. The blood lead concentration of 5 or 4.5 or 3.5 or 1.97 or whatever it was that you just said, whatever cutoff we use is clearly arbitrary. But as Sammy said, there's no safe level. And today, children's blood lead concentrations, children and adults' blood lead concentrations are 10 to 100 times higher than our pre-industrial ancestors. Given what we're seeing with this steep decrement in IQ at the lowest measurable levels, there's no reason to expect that we're not going to continue to see toxic effects down below 1 microgram per deciliter. So the blood concentration that's used, the action level, again, whether it's 4.5 or 3.5, is arbitrary and more a function of resource availability rather than whether something poses a hazard, a public health hazard.
Our next question is relating to the words significant and substantial. You've used the words significantly lower. Does this mean statistically significantly lower? And we see words like significant or substantial. Can you clarify these terms and how they impact the findings?
With respect to significant, it's a statistical language that we're using there, as in discernible from chance. When we use the word substantial, we're trying to make a point about the substantive as opposed to the statistically significant meaning of the result. The reference that we used throughout was the Flint water crisis. And so we use the word substantial when a particular task approaches the risk observed during the crisis.
A similar studies been done at other airports in densely populated areas. For example, San Carlos, San Jose International, Fullerton, John Wayne, Orange County, Santa Monica, Long Beach, or Hawthorne, etc. Also, does the study account for the number of airplanes in a given day, week, or month that take off from Reid-Hillview but do not stay in the pattern and land at another airport?
Sorry, David, could you repeat the question? I didn't follow the first portion of it.
So the first portion is asking about similar studies at other airports in densely populated areas, such as San Carlos, San Jose International, Santa Monica Airport, Long Beach, etc. And then the second part was asking whether the study accounts for the number of airplanes in a given day or week or month that take off from Reid-Hillview but do not stay in the pattern and land at another airport.
Again, we didn't have access to flight paths or the destination of the aircraft, and I'm not aware of other studies performed at these other airports mentioned.
We have another question relating to the runways at Reid-Hillview, and that the runways do not run north-south, they run more west than north, so northwest seems to be an accurate description. The predominant runway for pattern work or circuits is 31L with left traffic, putting the planes over the west and south of the airport, and the highest concentration of airborne exhaust is produced during the end of the takeoff roll at the northwest corner of the airport, upwind and left crosswind portions of the pattern. Upon turning downwind, if remaining in the pattern to land, most aircraft reduce engine RPM substantially. For aircraft arriving or departing on 31R, if they are in the pattern at all, as opposed to a straight-in arrival or any number of departures which are not downwind, the only ones which would ever put them in the area east of the airport, would mean the least used portion of the traffic pattern would be in the eastern corner of the pattern. Given these facts, one would expect to find the highest concentration of lead. The question cuts off, but I believe that they're asking primarily about the runway in relation to the wind, prevailing winds, and how this is factored into the study.
Sorry, David, you were cutting in and out, at least the way I heard you. I know it was a long question. What I can discuss, I suppose, is what we've learned subsequent to the release of the report vis-a-vis other point locations pursued along the runway that could potentially speak to the question with respect to the expectation with respect to the near angle. So let me pull that up. Okay. So as we noted in the report, our point location decision at the northwest end of the airport was motivated by previous research showing that the bulk of emissions released over the landing takeoff cycle occur at takeoff and climb out. This is work that comes to us from Carr et al. In 2011. Readers of the report have pointed to a recently published EPA report with model extrapolated estimates of airborne lead, emphasizing section C2.2 and accompanying figures C3, C5, showing that ground level lead concentrations appear to collect disproportionately at the southeast corner of the airport. While very important, the study of ground level emissions, Carr et al., Feinberg and Turner, and the EPA report itself note importantly that the run-up emissions account for only 11% of all airport lead emissions. Nonetheless, to address this possible concern, we examined various other points at the airport, all the way down to the southeast corner. We had to recapitulate child residential proximity to each of these points, and we had to reconfigure the near angle calculation at each of these points. Across all models rendered, we still observe a distance gradient, whether distance is measured linearly or if we take the square root of distance. It does appear that the distance effect amplifies as we move toward the southeast corner. The piston engine aircraft traffic effect, again, measuring the volume of traffic at the airport, behaves consistently regardless of where one puts the point. Now, with respect to near angle, we do observe a reduction in the coefficient corresponding to children residing east of the airport as we drift down the airport runway. So with respect to the question of the expected behavior of the prevailing winds across all locations that we studied, we see relatively consistent findings with respect to our indicators of risk.
How do you identify which lead in the air fuel comes from Reid-Hillview or San José Mineta Airport? Is it possible to identify that whether any of the lead present in the air near Reid-Hillview has come from San José Mineta, or how do you differentiate between the two?
Not possible to make that differentiation given the data in our possession. But again, I think one would be hard pressed to explain to me how emissions emanating from that airport, San Jose International, contaminate the observed relationship between the quantity of traffic at the airport and blood lead levels, contaminate the relationship between the quantity of aviation gasoline sold at the airport and blood lead levels, contaminate the distance gradient that we observe, the statistical interaction of those factors, and information pertaining to the movement of children to attend school. I don't see how that factor operates differently across distance, across the near angle, or contaminates the fluctuation of traffic. I just don't see it logically.
Another way to say that is, I don't even know the direction of that particular airport. It doesn't really matter. There are other sources of lead that these children might experience. What Sammy and his team have found is that over and above all those other possible sources, Reid-Hillview Airport increases children's blood lead levels if they live closer, if they live downwind, right? Each one of those levels that Sammy just went through. So these are over and above whatever other exposures may be out there. And that's what Sammy means when he looks at the independent contribution. There was another question I just wanted to provide a perspective on, which was, since the airplanes are only flying a short distance at the airport, a lot of the fuel they're using is going to be used off-site. That's true. Think about it like a smelter. The children who live closest to the smelter are going to still have the highest exposure, even if 80 or 90% of the smelter emissions are thrust up into the atmosphere and disseminated across the country. You're still going to see a signal. You're still going to see that the children who live in closest proximity have higher blood lead concentrations from that smelter, or in this case, from the airport.
Thank you. Can you provide or answer what are the health effects of bone lead?
The health effects from bone, as seen with bone lead, are essentially the same health effects observed from lead measured in the blood. The distinction, though, is that bone lead is a cumulative indicator or biomarker of exposure, a longer term indicator of lead exposure. And so typically when studies have been able to compare whether bone lead or blood lead predicts low birth weight or IQ deficits, bone lead invariably does better because it's giving us a much better indicator of how each person has been exposed to lead over their lifetime. Whereas blood lead, while it still gives us a ranking of exposure, is a relatively short-term exposure. Now, let me just give a little bit of background because that makes it seem a little bit less ideal than it is. There was a fascinating study from Australia. Brian Golson looked at Eastern European immigrants to Australia, and they were pregnant women. And the fingerprint of lead that's observed from Eastern Europe is distinct from the fingerprint of lead that Australians are exposed to. So he was able to show that about 2/3 of the lead circulating in the blood of the pregnant women were from past exposures and 1/3 from more recent exposures. So blood lead is giving us some indication of lifetime exposure, but bone lead is better. This also helps to clarify the point I made earlier that for toddlers, the majority of their exposure is recent. They're only 2 years old, right? And so most of the lead in their blood is from recent exposure or in the past 2 years, 2 years, 9 months at best if they're 24 months. So the lead in the blood will be a better indicator of recent exposure.
What would the baseline blood lead level be for children throughout the country? In other words, what is the average blood lead level for a typical child?
The average is under 1 microgram, is it not, Bruce?
That's right.
Have any studies been done to determine how far lead particles from aircraft emissions can drift due to wind, excuse me. If a plane departs from Napa and climbs to a sufficiently high altitude, could particles from that aircraft drift into San Jose?
I'm not familiar with those studies, unfortunately. I'm sure someone in the atmospheric sciences has pursued it, but it's not a literature that I'm familiar with.
I've not seen it specific to aviation fuel, but if, for example, you have a volcano in Iceland that emits lead and mercury and other toxic metals, it disseminates across the world. And relevant to this study, that would essentially be the background exposure that these children have, not the added impacts that Dr. Zoran and his team have found by looking at proximity, traffic, and so forth.
When you say east of the airport, do you mean the quadrant bounded by the easterly line and the southerly line?
Not exactly, no. Allow me to go to the report, share my screen. We have it here. Yeah, so this is what we mean by east. This slice right here that we observe with respect to the sample location of children over this 10-year period.
Thanks. Our next question. You said that our lead levels are significantly higher than our pre-industrial ancestors, but you also said that IQ levels are on the rise with each generation. Which is it?
One more time, please. That was a good question.
You said that our lead levels are significantly higher than pre-industrial ancestors, but you also said that IQ levels are on the rise with each generation. Which is it?
That's great. Okay, I think the question presupposes, right, that lead is the only contribution to measured intelligence.
And both can be true. So the way that we know lead is significantly higher in industrial people, us, than our pre-industrial ancestors began with Claire Patterson's work at Caltech. Claire was trying to use lead isotopes to come up with the age of the Earth, but he couldn't. He was vexed by the widespread contamination in the environment from leaded gasoline primarily. And so he had to create an ultra clean room at Caltech. And once he did this, meticulously created this ultra clean room, he calculated the age of the Earth was 4 billion years, and that stands. At the same time, he began to try to figure out, well, what is normal? And of course, we didn't know because we're all contaminated with lead. Well, what could he do? Well, he ended up finding the bones of 7-year-old indigenous Southwest Indians in the United States, pre-industrial, and measured the concentration of lead in bone, and that compared that to the concentration of lead in bone of people contemporary. This was 1960s when he first did this, and showed that it was about 600 times higher at that time. He also was the first to really, he took a glacial core sample. And every year you get deposition of atmospheric pollution on the glacier. And you can estimate going down and down this glacier and find out over the past 2,000 years what the levels of lead in the atmosphere were. And so he was able to corroborate what he found with the bones with atmospheric deposition. So that's how we know that the lead exposure that we have is still now, today, 10 to 100 times higher than our pre-industrial ancestors. In terms of the IQ increase, that's been studied since 1932, first by J.R. Flynn, as Sammy mentioned. That was why it was called the Flynn effect. And J.R. Flynn didn't believe it for several decades, that it just couldn't be true, he said. But every continent, he saw the same thing again and again. So every decade, there was about a 3-point increase in IQ, or every generation, about a 5 IQ point increase, until, as Sammy pointed out, recently it's plateaued. A variety of things contribute to that. Lead is probably one of several things. Better education is clearly another. Better nutrition, another. So there's lots of things that contribute.
If a child had an IQ of 100, how many IQ points would that child be expected to lose from the 1/5 of a microgram of lead produced at a 2 microgram per deciliter blood lead level?
At that level, as we discuss in the conclusion of the report, we can estimate the relationship based on the nonlinear slope that Dr. Lamphere has published. And we have, at that point, right, a half an IQ point loss per microgram per deciliter.
You stopped the outer ring of results collection at 1.5 miles. Dr. Zaran's reason for this was, quote, "We can't rule out other sources of lead farther out," end quote. Yet Zaran can conclusively confirm that lead is being sourced from the airport. How can you conclusively conclude the reasons of lead in blood close to the airport, but not farther out?
So there were two reasons motivating the suspension of the distance from the airport. The first is that we were aiming to guarantee that we were comparing like populations, that we could match children on observable characteristics. Beyond a mile and a half, we introduce different composition of the population that frustrates the ability to independently isolate the causes of interest. The second is that the prevailing wisdom is that beyond 2.5 kilometers from the airport, it's unlikely that we would see a significant effect.
I heard there is no minimum safe level of lead. However, how much air traffic is at Reid-Hillview, and how does that add to the lead pollution that I heard about? It sounded to me like most of it was from other factors.
Again, thank you for the question, but it was not the purpose of the study to fully partition observed blood lead levels in children to all sources. Again, we were interested in the independent, incremental add to blood lead levels attributable to indicators of risk emanating from the airport.
And I would just like to reiterate, especially if you focus on toddlers who are better indicators of ongoing exposure, and you look at the incremental increase in children's blood lead level and the incremental increase in the fraction of children who exceed 4.5 or 3.5, you can see that this is not trivial. These are not small increments. Collectively, they are quite substantial.
CDC segments lead levels for concern. The lowest level delineated on their scale is less than 5 micrograms per deciliter. The first level of concern is 5 micrograms per deciliter. They list suggested courses of action up to 70 micrograms per deciliter. You are concerned about lead levels that are so low they're not even listed as a concern. I know you made the point that there is no safe level of lead, but when the lead level measured in your study is less than 97.5% of all children, wouldn't these resources be better directed at communities where children have levels of lead that the CDC deems a cause for corrective action, rather than levels that are below the level of CDC concern?
Sammy, I'd like to start that. I've been involved with the CDC for 20 years in their lead poisoning prevention efforts. And at the beginning of every set of recommendations, they begin with primary prevention is the primary goal, preventing children's exposures before they occur. The action level of 5 microgram per deciliter is simply that. Once we have failed to protect children, once their blood lead levels exceed 5 microgram per deciliter, then new actions are required, case management, where we go in to try to identify the source. But that's also an indication that we failed to protect children in the first place. 5 microgram per deciliter is not safe. It is not intended to be the first step. Primary prevention has been, for the past 20 years, the first recommendation that CDC has made. And that's why addressing this problem is so important. This is getting at primary prevention, preventing exposure before children are harmed, not waiting for them to be damaged before we act.
Chris, I have nothing to add to that. Thank you.
Were there any significant trends or spikes in blood lead levels by year or traffic, not including the COVID year. I have noticed a significant reduction in traffic during months of wildfires where poor air quality was present.
So in every statistical model rendered, we have timing controls and seasonal controls. And so whatever is operating seasonally that we don't observe, or whatever is trending over the observation period, that is explicitly controlled for in the models.
Is there any evidence in general that engines warming up expel more lead than engines that are hot, meaning aircraft taxiing for takeoff versus aircraft landing from a recent flight?
I think that's a question best left for an aviation scientist. I could speak to questions pertaining to the statistical isolation of the independent effects at the airport.
Is it possible to find samples of children who move to or from the airport and compare their pre and post blood levels?
That's a fabulous question. We in fact aim to accomplish this, and over the 10-year period examined, I think we arrived at 200 children that we were able to adequately match in terms of a shift in residence, but we're not able to do sufficiently powered analysis on that subsample. But it is something that we did think of doing, and it's a fabulous idea.
Did you measure the household lead levels, for example, from paint, for any of the children measured in this study?
Thank you for that question. Allow me to share my screen again to remind of a figure that we have in the report pertaining to how we address the question of lead-based paint exposure. So here, this graphic shows the behavior of the two main sources of lead over the 20th century, lead in automotive gasoline and lead in paint. And let's focus our eyes on the navy blue line here, showing lead-based paint over time. And as you can see, by about 1960, the use of lead-based paint had declined by over 90% of its peak in the 1920s. So what we do is we look at every neighborhood around the airport and count the housing stock built in this period to control for this potential exposure risk.
And I'll just like to add, there's been a number of other studies that have been done using age of housing, which is primarily what Sammy's team did. And consistently, we've shown that that is a predictor of dust lead levels in the home and children's blood lead levels. So that's a good indicator, and certainly a more than adequate indicator of children's exposure to lead-based paint and lead dust.
Can you point to the eastern area where you found the highest concentrations of lead, not on the dot matrix chart, but on the overhead photo of the airport to accurately indicate to the local residents which area you're describing?
Yeah, it's going to take some effort to do that, to reconcile this image with this image. Let me orient myself here. So it's going to be this wedge right here, approximately.
We can't see your screen.
Share your screen.
Oh, sorry. So this is approximate, but it's going to be this wedge right here, where we observe substantially higher blood lead levels. Actually, this is San Martin Airport, my mistake. Apologies. Let me just go back. Okay. This right here.
If the aircraft are taking off mainly to the northeast and the prevailing winds are from the, well, the questioner says from the northeast, but I believe they're coming from the northwest, would not most of the lead be blown onto the airport property? The immediate vicinity to the southeast of the airport is the shopping mall. Is the shopping mall getting the brunt of any pollution?
Interesting. So the wedge that we used covered this area east of the airport. When you subdivide into octans, at least with respect to children under the age of 6, we do in fact see substantially higher blood lead levels in that bottom portion of the eastern quadrant. But when you include all children extending to the age of 18, we don't observe significant variation through that quadrant. In fact, the relationship between distance and near angle appears to be strongest in the northern portion of the eastern slice, proximate to where the aircraft maintenance activities are occurring at the airport.
We're now going to take a 10-minute break. We have some technical difficulties in the background, and we're going to spend a moment to restart a computer. So we'll be back with you at 8:40 p.m. Thank you. Worked in the background on some of the technical difficulties we were having. So now we'll resume the Q&A, and I'll invite David Bruno to present the next question.
Thank you. The next question is, do elementary school test scores near Reid-Hillview support your hypothesis regarding downwind versus upwind exposures? That is, are scores lower downwind?
That's a really excellent question. It's not something that we were able to pursue given the data available to us, but that is a question I'm most certainly curious about. There are, of course, other outcomes that would be interesting to observe around the airport, but that is most certainly one of the outcomes we'd be interested in testing.
What other studies need to be conducted to ensure the community's safety?
You know, these are discussions that Bruce and I have had, discussions had with California Department of Public Health. You know, ultimately, we would like to link the individual child where we observe substantially higher blood lead levels, follow them over the life course, find them in other administrative records, and make explicit linkages between blood lead levels observed and educational outcomes, health outcomes, etc. At this point, we're not in possession of the necessary data to make those linkages and to pursue those questions.
These graphs work in reverse. If blood lead exposure goes down, do kids get healthier or smarter? And when when unleaded gas comes to airplanes, will kids get healthier?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to share my screen and sort of recapitulate the logic of that question. I think it's a good one. So I'm going to focus on the interaction model. And instead here of looking at the relationship between piston engine aircraft traffic and blood lead levels by distance, let's look at aviation gasoline by distance. So again, what we have on the horizontal axis here is the quantity of aviation gasoline sold at the airport. And we have children in two distances, children that are proximate to the airport and children that are more distant from the airport. And as the questioner noted, the relationship is upward sloping. So that means as the quantity of lead formulated aviation gasoline at the airport increases, so too do the blood lead levels of children proximate to the airport. But the inverse is also true. That as we decrease the quantity of lead formulated gasoline sold at the airport, the blood lead levels of children subside. If we were to find an unleaded alternative, in effect, we would be moving toward the origin and the blood lead levels of children would meaningfully decline.
In the historic graph of annual tonnage of lead used in paint, the decrease between 1960 and 1970 seems almost nil. How would the study results change if the lead in paint were accounted for through 1970?
That's a good question. It's not something we've done yet, but it's something that we intend to do as part of this ancillary document that we're preparing, that we intend to make available to the public. But I don't suspect that the results will change meaningfully given the substantially smaller fraction of homes built in this period containing lead-based paint.
We learned in the 1940s that lead poisoning could be easily reversed with chelating agents like EDTA. Are the children in your study being damaged by alleged emissions being treated for this condition?
That's a good question. Not that I'm aware of. There was no indication in the data readily available as to whether or not the child was being treated.
And just to follow up on that, chelation for children was pioneered in the 1960s. For workers, it was somewhat earlier. There was a very large study in the United States that looked at using chelation treatment for children who had blood lead levels between 20 and 45 microgram per deciliter. So quite a bit higher than what we're talking about for these children. And there was no benefit of transiently reducing their blood lead levels. So what happened is that there was this several week to month long treatment. You could see blood lead levels go down in the children who were randomly assigned to the treatment group, but not the placebo group. But within weeks of taking children off the chelation, their blood lead levels came back to their baseline because once again, it was being taken out of the bone and back into circulation. But the point is they did not see any significant differences. So chelation is not recommended below 45 microgram per deciliter. And it's primarily to prevent children from dying from lead poisoning, not to prevent the brain-based injury that leads to IQ loss or ADHD type behaviors.
Lead in the area never goes away unless physically removed. How are you determining that the lead that was already in the area from long ago in the past, not from aircraft or the airport, is not what is causing the elevated blood lead levels today?
It's an excellent question. Allow me to share my screen. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to read something that's going to be technical, but it's straight from the report. We write, importantly, gamma sub j is the neighborhood or census block fixed effect. The inclusion of this term in the equation accounts for non-time varying unobservable factors which may influence blood lead levels that are common to sampled children within a given neighborhood, but varying across neighborhoods. These fixed effects absorb omitted variables by estimating a distinct mean blood lead value or intercept for each neighborhood. Now, I know that sounds really technical, but let me try to explain it to you by way of example. Let's suppose that we're interested in observing the relationship between whether or not a child receives a free or subsidized lunch at school and academic performance, because we have some intuition that nutritional supplementation improves performance. Let's suppose that we have all kinds of information on the child, historic performance on tests, the sex of the child, the age of the child, and so on. But let's suppose we also have some intuition that the classroom dynamics influence test scores or academic performance that may bias the relationship that we observe between nutritional supplementation and performance. Now, we may not have good information on all of the things that occur within the classroom, but if we include an indicator for every classroom in a school, across schools within a district, we can estimate coarsely the sum of all things occurring in that classroom that may implicate the outcome or may bias our estimate of the relationship of interest, that being nutritional supplementation and academic performance. Well, we do the same thing here in this study. There are many, many other factors that can implicate the outcome, including legacy deposition of lead from the airport. It could also spring from, proximity to historic land uses, like the San José Speedway, where cars racing around the oval were emitting lead in significant quantities. All of those factors are present in this neighborhood fixed effect. So imagine in our statistical model, every single neighborhood has a separate indicator, coarsely absorbing all of those unobservable factors that allow us to unbiasedly estimate the relationships of interest.
Have any studies been done to use equipment to directly measure the amount of lead exiting the tailpipe of an aircraft?
I believe the EPA has done reports in this direction. One of which I believe is titled Model Extrapolated Estimates of Airborne Lead Concentrations at US Airports. So I would refer you to this study to potentially find answers to the question.
It was mentioned that the study took into account other factors that could cause high lead, although no statistical analysis was made, just an indication that it was considered. Can you please dive deeper into what you saw when looking at other possible factors?
Good question. So all of the other coefficients not of interest to the study behaved as you might expect. As you increased the age of the housing stock in the neighborhood of the child's residence, that increased the blood lead levels of children. As you increase the quantity of toxic release inventory facilities that lead emit within a 2-mile radius of the child's place of residence, we observe an increase in the blood lead levels of children. We also observe, consistent with prior research, that boys present with higher blood lead levels than girls, and on and on and on.
What was the range of the gamma coefficients for the various neighborhoods within 1.5 miles of Reid-Hillview?
That's not something I have off the top of my head, but that's something that we could collect and share at some future date.
The deviations of graphs shown on slide 53 or figure 16 from the report are huge for the children that are within 1/2 mile. When you have this much deviation, it is generally assumed you can't make a conclusive conclusion. How are you able to make the conclusion that the distance from the airport and avgas sold is the cause when the numbers are all over the place? You're on mute, Sammy.
Can you repeat the question, David? What slide was the questioner referring to exactly?
Bear with me a moment. I need to pull the question back. The deviations on the graph shown on slide 53 or
53.
figure 16 from the report.
This right here? Slide 53?
You just share
And-
your screen.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Just let me double back here. So slide 53. Yes, the intervals of confidence are wide here, corresponding to children that are most proximate to the airport, but substantially less wide when looking at the relationship between piston engine aircraft traffic and blood lead levels by distance. Despite the wide intervals of confidence here, we can conclude that the relationship is discernible from chance.
Our final question, tailpipe sniffers are required to accurately determine how much lead actually leaves an aircraft during combustion. How can you actually know how much lead leaves the engine of an aircraft? I understand how you can determine the amount of lead in aircraft fuel and even weigh it. However, that really does not explain where you get the 1,000 metric ton number of lead that is surrounding Reid-Hillview Airport.
So again, I relied on an EPA estimate of the amount of lead that exits the aircraft, and that figure is 95%.
So once again, as we had happen yesterday night, we had more questions than time available. As we stated the other night, we will try and prepare written responses to those questions that we did not get to. There were some questions that weren't pertaining to the study, and so those we'll try to answer in writing. Also, I want to call your attention to the board meeting on August 17th at 6 p.m., where the board members will review the study and staff recommendations with respect to what to do with the findings of the study. Before we conclude, I want to thank the Spanish interpreters this evening, and then the Vietnamese interpreters and our American Sign Language interpreters. Thank you, Jennifer Jackson. Also, Peggy Doyle and Colin Cooch from our clerk of the board, who very capably managed this meeting. Mr. David Bruno, who has volunteered his evening once again to assist us with this process. And of course, Dr. Zaran and Dr. Lanfear, who have been very capably have spent a couple of days and answered many questions, probably over 140 questions. And then finally, I'd like to thank Supervisor Wasserman, who represents this area. We wish you a good evening. And again, if you'd like to speak to the board with respect to this, we invite you to our meeting on August 17th. Thank you and have a good evening.